Many universities study the topic of the future of energy or the energy transition as a policy issue or from research in environmental sciences. USC is adding another facet with a look at energy systems from the aspect of business. Dr. Shon Hiatt from Marshall School of Business at USC is our next guest on the podcast. Dr. Hiatt is the director of the Business of Energy Transition Initiative. His new course looks at traditional business models for fossil fuel-based industries, as well as new entrepreneurial models for alternative energy sources. This is a critical background for new graduates thinking about the startup route or to join the energy transition. Listen in and see what you can learn from Dr. Hiatt.
Well, welcome, Dr. Hiatt, Sean, to our Energy Transition Talk podcast, season two. Um, just to get started here a little bit, could you introduce yourself, give us a little personal background, and want to tell us what got you into this business of the energy transition?
Thank you. Yes. My name is Shon Hiatt. I am actually a native of the state of Idaho, which is in the northwest of the United States. I spent most of my childhood working on our family's dairy farm and working also for my neighbors during the harvest season on driving the combine for the wheat farmers. Um, and so I've been interested in agribusiness in a way. And then as things kind of moved on and I went to college, the agribusiness changed quite a bit from just providing food to moving to actually, in a way, of providing energy. I did an undergraduate work at Brigham Young University in Utah, and then I went to Cornell University where I did a master's and PhD. My dissertation was, investigating this, and it was on the emergence and growth of the biodiesel market, which, if you look at that and the history of it, it really was put together by soybean farmers for the most part as a way to raise the commodity prices of soybeans in the United States. And of course, other types of farm associations got on board, the seed oil farm associations like canola and sunflower, safflower, etc. And it really created one of another type of biofuel. I mean, we've had maize ethanol for a very long time, corn ethanol, but this was like probably one of the first instances of moving into much longer chain type of biofuels um, through a simple transesterification process. So anyway, that's what got me very interested into this. My dissertation was on it, and I've continued to work on aspects related to entrepreneurship strategy in the energy sector.
Well, thanks. That's an interesting kind of way of getting into all of this. I actually grew up for the first several years of my life on my family's farm in southeastern Colorado. So we're raising animal feed, alfalfa, and things like that. And then my dad moved up the value chain, and we got a ranch in the mountains in Colorado and started raising cattle. And certainly our life was very much impacted by the commodity price of beef. As it there were good years and there were bad years, all depend on the price of beef with regard to that. So, but thank
Yeah.
you for your background. Let's rush on. Why don't you start talking about our main subject here of the cost of going
Yeah.
green?
So I'll just jump right into it. One of the big questions surrounding the energy transition is the cost of going green, right? And experts are coming up with a forecast still, but the running consensus is around a couple trillion to tens of trillions of dollars. So by either mark, it's pretty expensive. And there are still debates between public and private funding, between a rich nation and developing nation shares. What is your opinion on this issue?
I think with regards to the price, yes, it is expensive. And one of the reasons it's expensive is because a lot of these proposals put out there is to reduplicate an existing energy infrastructure, right? They want to build a new one that essentially is much more electrified rather than using the existing infrastructure we have now, which a lot of it, we do have electrical, but we also have a molecule based. So think of pipelines, liquids or solids, right?
Hmm.
So this is why it's so expensive. It's the proposals like, hey, let's just redo and create a new infrastructure. That's the
Yeah.
one of the biggest costs behind this.
Doesn't that sound kind of wasteful though? Why is it not like repurposing existing infrastructure?
I mean, that is the big question, right?
Oh,
Is that
yeah.
so people need to ask this, like, is it worth us to actually create a new infrastructure?
Hmm. Wow. And I know climate financing is a big issue, and at this year's UNFCCC COP29 meeting, they were talking a lot about that. What do they really decide on for a path forward?
Well, they are suggesting that they want to, essentially, their argument is if you want poor countries, those with lower purchasing power,
Hmm.
to pay for more expensive energy, which it is,
Hmm.
from more intermittent type of renewables, then it's going to require more money. And so hence you need to essentially transfer wealth from those higher GDP countries such as Europe or North America to them at a rate of about 300 billion a year. So
Wow.
that is their request. I mean, economically, it makes sense. Why they're asking for this? Because it is more expensive. Um, but the question is where are they going to get the money? I mean, I don't know
Yeah.
where they're going to get the money. Europe barely has enough money to cover their finances. Many of the countries in the Eurozone have been running deficits. In the United States, we're pushing a $1.9 trillion deficit this next year, is what the Congressional Budget Office has already put forth, which kind of makes Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy's like claim to find $2 trillion in savings quite important because we're almost running a $2 trillion deficit. So,
Hmm.
so this is like the big question: where are they going to get the money to do this? This is why I'm not sure that this will actually happen.
Yeah. And is there even an enforcing body that governs this, like forces these countries to send that money?
No, there isn't. And this kind of goes back to this idea of sovereignty, right? So every country is a sovereign on its own, can do whatever it wants. I mean, you can enter into treaties that may have some teeth involved. I mean, we have different treaties with regards to contracts and property rights. So, for example, some countries can sign into it, but the only teeth really is that, if they fail to uphold their contracts, maybe they don't get help from like the World Bank or the International Finance Corporation. I mean, those are kind
Yeah.
of like the only enforcers out there that are third party. Otherwise, it's just essentially maybe trade
Yeah.
is the other issue, which seems to be in this new administration, trade tariffs and such seem to be a tool that may be coming back to instead of as a type of diplomatic lever.
It seems like, at least to me, it's gonna be best if private companies create better, clean ways of getting energy that are cheaper. I think that that'll be the only way forward. 'Cause I don't see any country sending $300 billion to, developing countries right now.
Yeah, it's probably
I guess it's up to.
unlikely.
Hmm.
Just on that note, though, I mean, that let's as we think about like the price of technology, right? And in the business sense, we have this aspect we call the economies of scale. And the idea behind this is that if you continue to make something, right, then you can actually figure out ways, improvements to lower the cost of making it. So the more that you make, right, you are able to learn and lower those prices at the same time as you're increasing what you're making, your bargaining power increases. So that means you could put more pressure on your suppliers to lower their costs because you're such now an important customer for whatever the product you're making. So as you increase in scale, usually the costs go down. And that's what we've seen, especially and like as you think about solar panels. I mean, China's the number one solar panel in the world. Not
Hmm.
and not, I mean, to a large part because they have large government incentives to engage in solar. I mean, I was reading a report last year where a dairy company decided to get into the solar panel business because the government
Wow.
incentives were so good, right?
Right.
So you have
Yeah,
food, yeah,
yeah.
companies now making solar panels in China.
That's incredible. It's incredible.
Well, I guess it's back to the old adage, put your money where your mouth is, right? And right now, with policy commitments, there's a lot of countries who might be willing to make a commitment, but then writing the check is really based on, back to market economics and how much money you have to invest and what is the return and all of those good things. So we understand you've started a new course. I believe it's called The Business of Energy in the 21st Century. Um,
Yes.
I got involved in developing a course at a university level a few years ago, and I recognize it's a lot of work. I mean, doing all of the research for all of the programs and the assessment processes and all the rest of this. Can you tell us a little bit about your course description and objectives?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so this course actually comes out of this new initiative that we have at the business school called the Business of Energy Transition Initiative. And the initiative itself has kind of three main roles, and one of it is research component. So we have postdoctoral researchers doing uh, research on different types of business models and innovations in energy. We have a teaching or student focus. The initiative sponsors an undergraduate business club. We bring in people monthly from the industry to come speak to students. It's in our Energy Leader Speaker Series. We're also, and the class is actually one of the aspects that's also launching from this teaching focus. And then the third one is our practitioner engagement. So this is where we try to really bridge the divide between, academia and students. And with industry, we host an annual energy business summit where we bring in top leaders from energy companies, so CEOs, senior vice presidents, to come in and talk to us about the opportunities and challenges facing their business right now and where they think the opportunities are going. We just had our first annual conference. It was a tremendous success, and we're already in the works for planning our second annual conference this next September. Okay, so let me jump into this course, which is regarding the student aspect. So, one of the things is that I run into wonderful students who really want to take their education and try to improve society, improve the world. And one of the things that they say is like, oh, well, I just want to go out and I want to, invest in this renewable energy company and, we'll be able to like have everybody, adopt this technology. So I think it's an incredible business opportunity. And it's like, well, it could be valuable. Let's kind of dig into this. Um, and so we have a lot of students who are doing this. The issue though is that as they get a little deeper, they realize, well, and some don't, but they will after they get some capital and put a lot of time in, that the energy systems are extremely complex, right? And
Yeah.
it's not just a matter of plug and play, that we could pull out one type of energy source and stick in a new one and everything will be the same, right? These aren't Lego blocks. So
Hmm.
I created this course to help give students an understanding of energy systems, of understanding like how is value created. And there are many complementaries and there's synergies involved in this. And so you just can't take one piece out, say like a coal plant, and replace it with a wind turbine plant and expect the same type of results. So and that's just only like on the electricity side, right? The other thing we have to understand as we think about the business of energy is beyond also transportation, right? So most people only think about it in terms of transportation. Oh, if we could just electrify the entire fleet, have electric vehicles, we'll never need fossil fuels again, right? And what they don't quite understand is that nearly 75 to 78% of all fossil fuels are going to non-transportation issues, such as petrochemicals or industrial energy, industrial processes. I mean, I'm kind of a big fan of Vaclav Smil, who has written that there are four key pillars of modern society: cement, steel, plastics, and ammonia. Right? And if you look at these four, these are what led to a modern society. Right? I mean, if we didn't have steel or cement, what could we actually build? Right? And
Yeah.
plastics, everything we have, Almost all of our clothing has plastics in it. Our phones, our electronics, our vehicles are all made of plastics. And ammonia is the important building block of all fertilizer, which, due to the Green Revolution and the Haber-Bosch process that the Germans perfected in the late 19th, early 20th century, right? We're now able to feed the entire world where before we had massive hunger and people dying of
Yeah.
starvation. So these things are derived, like that ammonia comes from natural gas, right? And how we create it. So there are some real issues, real aspects of like what we call hard to abate type areas, meaning hard to move away from our existing hydrocarbon economy. And so this is the one thing that they're going to learn, right? So we go through from the beginning, and we go through like the markets of coal or petroleum, pipelines. We look at carbon sequestration. We focus a lot on like the hydrocarbon sector for the first half, so they can have a real understanding of like where's the value inputs. Because if they wanted to move into this, right, then it's like, okay, so how do you then switch that? Maybe you need to think of a biofuel or think of a sustainable aviation fuel, because we're not going to electrify our jets, right? Nobody is going to want to fly,
Yeah.
and spend 3 or 4 days flying across the Atlantic or something in like an inflatable, dirigible or something again, with electric powered, because, we value the time to get across. So in this case, right now, what we have is you'll need to have some sort of like hydrocarbon to power that fuel, that aviation. So and then we move into like the electric markets, which are also very interesting. Because one of the things that most people don't consider is what is the true levelized cost of energy. And the levelized cost of energy is a simple formula to help um, entrepreneurs and investors understand like what is the actual rate that I should charge when I put this project in, right? So I can get a return on 15 or 20 or even a 30 year, depending on what I believe the life of this facility is going to be, right? And it's based on like the cost that goes in, the fixed cost, the variable costs of running it, etc., and the amount of time it's going to be running. Now, the problem with this LCOE is it's worked very well with baseload energy. So things like a coal plant or a large reservoir hydro that's running all the time, right?
Mhm.
But when you're dealing with intermittent renewables, right, the true levelized cost of energy becomes much more fuzzy. And this is because as the percentage of these intermittent energy sources go onto the grid, right, they generate grid costs for the grid to deal with the volatility of the energy produced, right? And so this has led to a number of these engineering economists to come up with different types of formulas, which they call either like the full system levelized cost of energy. But essentially, from what the general consensus so far is that once intermittent renewable penetration on a grid reaches between 25 and 30%, the costs begin to escalate.
And why
And
is that?
well, that's because you have to pay for that intermittent cost of energy. Let's just take solar, for example, which is it's easier to understand than it's like the wind, which is very volatile. Solar, we can kind of predict when the sun's going to be up and down. We know that. And barring cloud, like if you're in a very sunny area, it's probably not too much of a problem. But if you're penetrating and you're getting like say 40% of solar, right, then you've got to power down now your excess electricity somehow during the daytime, or what are you going to do with those surplus electrons? Or you shut
Mhm.
down facilities. Well, if you shut down facilities and idle them, you curtail, as they say in the industry, there's a curtailment. Then you can't get that same return anymore on that investment. So that means the price that you have to charge to get that return has to go up. Okay. So the more
Yeah.
curtailment in the system among all these generators that begin because of the intermittent electrons coming in, the greater the costs. And so this is why we see countries such as in Northern Europe, and we see this in California also, where intermittent renewable penetration increases, the cost of electricity begins to skyrocket. And so as we think about, and one of the big things that I talk about in this class is if you're going to create value for a product, every energy system needs to balance five factors. Energy security, right, which is you have control over your energy. Energy safety, which is kind of a given in developed
Yeah.
economies. Um, Energy reliability, affordability, and cleanliness, right? So you've got to balance these five factors. If you focus only on one to the neglect of the others, right, you're going to lose the value proposition, and people are not going to want to essentially want that type of
Yeah.
product, right? And and so this is the thing that we're seeing in many areas is that there's been a large focus now on the cleanliness factor to the neglect of the reliability or the affordability factor. What does this mean? Well, it means that, the people themselves, the customers are not going to be happy with those
Yeah.
products. So I'll
I
pause.
think, go ahead. I think you've told a really good story of what we've described in some other cases about the complexity of an energy system and all of you can't just say the wind is free, so I'm going to develop free electrons, right? There's all these other aspects of it. We had a chance to talk to a energy planner for SoCal Edison to talk to us about the duck curve, and he went. It was a great explanation of the challenges that utilities have of this intermittency sort of factor of there are times when you are curtailing, turning back energy, and another times when you have to get base loads from someplace, some storage or gas powered peaking plants or whatever it is. So we really turned the challenge of the utility business model into something a lot more complex, a lot more almost minute by minute rate, kind of base things in order to recover their costs. So dealing with this naivete that I mean, it's great that there's the enthusiasm of your students, but you're breaking down the problem into these important elements where all of a sudden, they're recognizing it isn't so easy to just to jump in replacing the molecules with the electrons in our complex modern society. So
Mhm.
I think that's really good. We even had an episode on green steel to try to poke the challenge of replacing the hydrocarbon source in industrial processes. So
Oh,
clearly
that's
that's
very
another one
difficult.
element
Yeah.
well.
Oh, that is super difficult. And according to the steel makers that I've spoken to, right? I mean, for steel recycling, it's possible. But and again, the problem with steel recycling is it's generally not as good as the original, right? This is different than aluminum or glass. Like aluminum, like you're getting back to the basic model, the element of aluminum, right? So when you make aluminum, but steel, right, it's got all these different types of composites in there. You got like some manganese, you got some, carbon and iron ore, right? And so when you recycle it all together, you're going to lose a lot of that dexterity. And again, you can have electric arcs for recycling, but again, to create that I guess very strength or tensile, the specific type of steel that you want. Right now, it seems like we still need that natural gas to get that heat to be able to create that particular type. Again, people are talking about hydrogen as being like a potential replacement of natural gas, and that's something to consider also.
But again, the carbon sometimes is part of the product, and that's also true in with some of the things with cement. In making cement, sometimes the fuel is part of the product. So again,
That's right.
we talked about a steel mill in Pueblo, Colorado, that is a steel recycler, electric arc
Hmm.
furnace kind of a setup where married with carbon sequestration and all the rest of this, that model may be all right, but it doesn't address all of our other kind of issues.
Hmm.
Um, but we know there are opportunities and there are challenges. So, Roshan, why don't you kind of dive into that?
Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit before, but the energy transition will create a lot of new business opportunities. I was talking about innovators before being a good solution, but can you share your perspective on the changing business environment in the energy transition era?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's been a lot. there's been a lot of money plowed into this energy transition. A lot of it, you could say, could be due to hype, which also drives investment. A lot of it is government incentives, such as the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has brought a lot of investment into storage opportunities, into carbon sequestration opportunities, as well as renewable fuels, and not from necessarily agricultural products, but from like a type of carbon sequestration where they could take that carbon dioxide or carbon that they capture and then use that to generate, larger carbon trains. Again, very energy intensive to do this, but there's government support money for this. And again, we could talk about this later, but I'm not so sure how much of these subsidies are going to remain over this next year. I think there's going to be changes there, but we can get to that later. Regardless, I think that there's still massive demand for this type of energy, largely coming from technology companies such as Amazon, Meta, Google, Microsoft. I mean, there's always been a demand for their data centers, but right now we're moving into this, what could be a new type of technological revolution with artificial intelligence. And the deep learning that's required, and we talk about this in this class also, as we think about AI and energy demand, we go over this. The deep learning that these GPU processors use can use 9 to 10 times more energy, electricity, than your typical CPU data center. Okay, what does that mean? That means they need massive amounts of power. The talk now is that Amazon and Microsoft want to, and Google as well, Alphabet, want to put in what they call gigafactories or giga scale data centers, where they're like 1,000 megawatt data centers that are for GPU learning. Okay, where are we going to get this electricity? One of the problems that we've had over the last 4 years in this country is that we've been shutting down baseload energy. Through federal government regulations, we've been shutting down, and there mainly have been coal plants, by the way, that have been shutting down. The problem is they've shut these down without any replacement. Okay, and so we've now hit to the point where we have barely enough electricity to prevent brown or blackouts in many of the grids across the country, in particular the PJM grid, which runs from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, through Ohio, and has even the city of Chicago as part of it. So this grid is like barely on, and a lot of the data centers are located in this area, as well as Virginia. Virginia is part of the PJM. So where are they going to get this energy? Well, they're continuing to pay premium prices for what they call zero emission energy, and that will continue whether or not we have subsidies for solar, wind, or whatever, geothermal matter. It doesn't matter. But the great thing is they've realized that they just can't do it with solar, wind alone. And so we've seen a recent turn of events where they're now investing in what I consider to be myself better technologies, such as nuclear and geothermal. And the reason why these are better is because they are baseload energy sources. They can run all the time. Hence, you could do a levelized cost of energy system and have like the real price that's not going to lead to these inflationary system prices in the grid. So this is where we're seeing a lot of investment right now, is in new types of geothermal technology, and I could talk more about that, as well as nuclear, and we think about the small modular nuclear reactor.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what you were talking about with geothermal and small modular nuclear reactor? I know one of the professors we had on before, I think it was Dr. Jafarpour, who was talking about the modular nuclear reactors. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we've if you look at the small modular reactor, we have had many different types, right? There's like different salts that they use, molten salts. There's like low boiling water or low pressure boiling water type of reactors, which are the most common, to tell you the truth, because they're based on similar technologies that we use in the Navy. the nuclear fleet, right? I mean, essentially a small modular nuclear reactor using like a low pressure water system is not that different than what powers a nuclear submarine or an aircraft carrier. Now, mind you, the difference being the Navy doesn't, it does not fall under the regulations of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Okay. So they're
Really?
able to launch these reactors and just stick them in their vehicles. Whereas civilian falls under the heavy burden of regulations from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And the problem with this is that they're still using the same regulations for large scale nuclear as they're using for a very much lower risk small modular reactor. Why do I say they're much lower risk? Because you do not need all the duplicity of backup systems, cooling systems for these reactors because they're so small. So you got to think about this as the size of these reactors go up. It's not just like a linear risk curve, but the risk curve is much more of a logarithmic type curve. Okay. So that means you bring this down to a small scale, 50 megawatt or under, they say small modular is under technically 300 megawatts is like the term they've been using. But you move this down to a 300, 200, 100 megawatt boiling water reactor, and the chances of having a meltdown are very low. Very, very low. I mean, they're set up to such that they don't need power to cool, right? That is the key to avoiding a meltdown. So I
Yeah.
think it's actually wonderful. The problem is the costs are extremely high due to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Now, Congress did pass an act to try to readjust and come up with new regulations for SMR. So we're hoping that happens. I was just at Sandia National Laboratory this last summer speaking with experts there. So if you know, the United States has a number of these, what they're called government kind of run energy laboratories under the Department of Energy, and they focus generally on nuclear energy. They're dual-based mission. I mean, they originally started and they still have it on nuclear defense for defense, but they
Yeah.
also have provide information and research for civilian type of nuclear power. And the folks at Sandia are particularly over safety, right? That is their big issue is the safety issue. So I spoke with them and asked, you know, because I've been interviewing and having conversations with several CEOs of these new small modular reactor companies, and they're quite optimistic about when they're going to be able to launch their product. And I asked people at Sandia, I said, when do you think we can get these on the market? I mean, I'm hearing from some of these CEOs 2026, 2027.
Wow.
And they laughed at me and they said, I don't think we're going to have any of these SMRs in the United States licensed running until about 2030 at the earliest.
Why
Uh,
is that?
and it's because of the regulations. The regulatory costs are super high, right?
Mhm.
And the whole idea, but the reason that they're using this term called small modular. Modular is the key here, right? It's not just that they're small. The idea of modularity is this aspect that's synonymous with scale. Remember we talked about scale earlier? That if you could build something and build a lot of them in a factory, you create an economy of scale, you could lower the price. So the idea of the
Yeah.
SMRs is that they're not going to build them on site like they built before the large ones, like the
Yeah.
Vogtle nuclear plant that just came online in Georgia. Instead, they'll build them in a factory and then ship them to a place where they'll just simply put them. Okay. So they'll already be all set up, factory
Mhm.
made. That's the idea of the modular nuclear. And if we could do that, then we could tremendously lower the costs. Okay. But the problem is
Yeah.
the regulations that are involved in this are prohibiting the development at a price point where we could really get these SMRs to take off. Right now, utilities are balking at the price that these SMRs would have to pay, the first ones, to get a return on investment. So they're not
Mhm.
signing up. But this is where
Yeah.
these technology companies come in. They're price insensitive because the amount they could charge for people using their AI. So
Yeah.
they could strike purchasing power agreements with these SMRs and hopefully get a few of them going enough that the scales can begin to pick up, the modularity, right? The prices can start to
Mhm.
come down. And hopefully on the regulatory side, we can get some of these regulations gone that shouldn't be
Yeah.
there, or to think more out of the box. right?
Yeah.
And again, this is why maybe this Department of Government Efficiency might have a positive impact. I just saw I follow it because I'm interested in seeing what they might have in terms of energy. And one of the things that they've talked about is using this Department of Government Efficiency to address issues that are related to the high regulatory costs for geothermal and nuclear, right? And so
Yeah.
let's see.
So does geothermal also have really high regulatory costs? Like, what are some of the ones that are associated with that?
Yeah, it generally because when they're on federal land, most of a
Oh,
lot of the geothermal energy is on federal land, and so we have what's called the National Energy Protection Act, NEPA. It's very
mhm.
similar to California's CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, which essentially prevents any type that we can't build anything in the state of California because of CEQA. I mean, it's if you look at the data from the PUC, the California PUC, right? It takes on average 13 years from the time somebody wants to build either a district transmission line or a power generation plant, whatever. 13 years
Wow.
for them when they say they're going to do it and they first put notice on PUC to the time that they could actually get it done. And most of those years are just regulatory years, back and forth with paperwork, back and forth, back and forth. Okay. This is what we mean by regulatory costs. And it's
Wow,
millions of dollars because they come back, so you got to do this study, and they come back, okay, we did it. All right, now you got to redo it again. So the same thing is that we have an issue with the United States is with the national energy. And again, these laws were put in place for a good reason, right? I mean, the reason is like we got to protect the environment. And again, that's important. That's one of the five pillars. Cleanliness is an aspect we have to think about when we're building these energy systems. And so I'm not against not destroying the environment, but everything has a
mhm.
trade-off. And so we need to be sensible, I believe, right, in designing these regulations. Um, and so there was a recent bill that went through Congress to help lower some of the costs related to NEPA as it pertains to geothermal exploration on federal land. So in other words, they're able to do much more exploratory drilling holes
Mhm.
without having to go through such an onerous regulatory process through the Interior Department and through NEPA.
Mhm.
It's interesting. Their recent kind of electricity transaction that Southern Cal Edison bought into a geothermal plant from Fervo, but they put it in Utah. So the way to get around the California uh, troubles in trying to site a facility and develop a facility is you put it in Utah and just connect the transmission lines to Los Angeles, and then somehow you can get around some of these things. But Bill Gates is a big investor in small nuclear reactors, so
Mhm.
maybe we'll see some kind of changes in all of that.
Yeah,
I
no, it's
just want to
very interesting on that. Just on that point, like they already have this high transmission lines directly from this area of Utah to Southern California because the Los Angeles Water and Power Department, the city of Los Angeles has their own power department. They have a massive coal plant in the central Utah that's
Wow.
been generating a lot of it. Now they're turning that thing into a natural gas plant and then soon into a hydrogen plant. But I mean, so there's already a nice power line grid that they can use.
see there's a good example of reuse instead of rebuild.
Hmm.
Just want to get on one theme that you brought up a little bit earlier. You're inspired, enthusiastic new student. By the way, Roshan may be taking your class here in a couple of years.
Yeah, I've
But,
heard.
but anyway, um, you want to capture that enthusiasm and you capture that energy from the next generation. But as they look at the complexity of these energy systems and they go through it, the first thing they look at is the wind is free and the sun is free, so therefore you got free fuel to begin your kind of system with that. Then you have what has now recently been one of the most generous public subsidies in the Jobs Act and things like that for nuclear, for renewable energy, clean energy sources. So right now, there's a lot of subsidies. There's a lot of tax breaks. There's a lot of incentives from the public sector in order to try to start these companies. And obviously all you have to do is figure out how to get the grant, right? And then all of a sudden you're off and running. And there are some angel investors in this area too, so they write big checks sometimes. But you can't live forever off of subsidies, right? There comes a period of time when your revenue has to exceed your cost, right? And make a profit if you're going to be in I guess, a capitalist sort of system. I guess that's one of the big challenges that you have to teach is that these business models at some time don't have that public funding available to them anymore. And then they have to have a business model where they have a customer who's willing to pay a price and your cost has to be affordable is one of your pillars, right? So this absolutely hits one of those. How do you teach that idea of at sometimes your company has to make a profit, even if all these entrepreneurial startups, they kind of start up in a different kind of environment. But sooner or later they've got to live in this real market world and have
Oh,
to go
yeah.
through that reality.
Oh, it's 100% about profit. I mean, that's exactly what this is about. We don't, yeah, no, and this is, I think that's what makes our initiative, our center, very unique among all the different energy centers that are across the United States. Most of them focus on policy, right? Ours is focused on the business of energy. So it is about return, 100% return on investment. So there's always a return involved. And the question is how quick can you get that return? Of course, you need capital to be able to build and to be able to get that return. Capital can come from many different ways. I think that there's no end in sight in terms of private capital. From our last Energy Business Summit, we had a energy finance panel, with the top CEOs of some of the top largest investment bankers and private equity companies in energy and came and spoke on a panel, and they said there's no end in sight for investments for these projects, with or without subsidies.
But then I really it's great that you focus that on this idea that at the end of the day, it's not getting a grant, it's not getting a compliance to a policy, it's actually creating a sustainable business.
It is, yes.
And so I actually just had one last question before we wrap up here.
Mhm.
But I was wondering, are we investing enough in fossil fuels to keep us afloat until we can create renewable sources that are more robust for energy?
Now, and this is a really good point you made up, Roshan. And this is something we have to think about, right? And I think this is why, and this is one of the reasons I founded this initiative. I spent a summer in Portugal, or a full year actually, on sabbatical. The whole family is lovely. Had a research project there, which I've already published a paper now looking at European energy markets. And this is the one thing I noticed there was like, wow, they're really pushing super hard at forcing this type of transition. And now we're seeing the impact is basically deindustrialization of the continent because the energy prices have become so expensive and it's leading to energy poverty. And if you can't use your industry because your energy costs are so high and you need these energy inputs, not just to make it, but because they are inputs, just like James said, right, then you have a problem. And so as we think about the transition is a very long thing. It's not going to happen by some arbitrary date that, a governor or a president says by 2035, we're going to be carbon neutral. The transition will have succeeded. No, it should, and in my perspective, it should be 100% market driven, and it will be market driven because we know fossil fuels are a limited resource, right? And if we just let the market play its part, people are going to see this. Even the oil companies themselves know this. They have the reserves. They're the most forward-thinking companies on the planet. I mean, no other company that I know produces a 50-year perspective, and I'm referring to ExxonMobil, right? Because they have to know they make huge investments that take years to develop, and then they have to pull this resource out of the ground, and they have to then project, is this going to be worth it for us to make these investments? So yes, I think that we can. I think it's going to take time, but as I think, through this entire 21st century, we will still be using fossil fuels. Now, the degree to which they might be used towards transportation, that transportation is the easiest thing to address, right?
Yeah.
The more hard to abate, I mean, we've got the rest of the century to figure that out. But I don't think it needs to be an aspect where we need to shut off the supply, right, of fossil fuels to try to create that, because that's only going to lead to what we've seen is deindustrialization and energy poverty. I mean, we need the fossil fuels right now while we also develop new types of energy sources and processes for when these fossil fuels just are no longer there, or they're so scarce that the prices are so high, right, that we need an alternative. And I think ultimately that's what's going to happen. The market's going to drive that. We will get to the point where, as the fossil fuel prices will be so high that the alternatives will be much more interesting and valuable.
Well, that's all I have to ask. Dr. Conte, do you have anything else to add?
Just, I mean, to your point, 2 years, the last 2 years after the shutdown of the Russian pipeline gas into Germany, they've been in recession.
Yes.
And the deindustrialization, the movement of some of their massive chemical facilities and car making facilities, steel, et cetera, are now having to go someplace else because it's too expensive to do business there. And
It's a
that's obviously
tragedy.
leading now to the almost they're going to have a new government pretty soon because of the some of the public outcry against what's happening economically.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of the decisions, I mean, to me, I still scratch my head. One of the first things that Green government did was shut down their last remaining nuclear power plants that provide base load energy, right? And so when they got the natural gas shut off from Russia, then it's like, well, what do you have? It is a real tragedy because Germany has always been the industrial hub of Europe when it comes to manufacturing, advanced manufacturing. And if they don't have that, then what is the future of Europe? I mean, is it just going to be a tourist destination? This is the big question, and it's something that the Europeans and Germany and these different countries should be thinking about.
Well, they still have some of the best soccer clubs, in the world. So maybe there's a
Maybe
bit
it's
there.
soccer. Yeah.
Um, last closure here with regard to all of these things. We've hit on a lot of questions. You've given us a very broad perspective. Your 5 pillars on a business model and the energy in the 21st century, I think, is extremely helpful for any young entrepreneur who wants to try to get into this market. Is there anything else that we have not talked about that you think is important that you'd like to get onto the podcast in terms of
Yeah, I'll just
uh,
throw one thing we didn't
communication to our
mention.
audience?
Yeah, I'll throw one more thing out there because one thing we didn't think about, it's also in my syllabus, as the movement away from fossil fuels to less dense energy sources requires tremendous amount of metals, right? Metals and mining. And so we talk about that, and those are opportunities, business opportunities as well, is where are we going to get the metals that are needed um, to run these new types of energy technologies. And unlike iron ore, right, which you could find in large portions, right, that it comes in like high density, a lot of these metals are in just, we're talking the 0.001 percentage in the ground. So you have to excavate so much earth and mass out to just refine some of these metals. And I'm not even referring to the rare earth metals, which are even further away. I mean, we're just talking about some of the things such as, you know, cobalt. If it's not DRC, like cobalt, United States, right? Or
Copper is another one, manganese,
copper.
nickel.
Copper has become this thing, right? Where now copper, we used to have veins that were in the single digit percentages. Now we can't get them anymore.
No, that's true. We're going from big oil to big dig with regard to some of the critical minerals needed to the electrification of the many processes that we sort of
Yeah,
have.
but again, think about this. It's not just the dig too, but is there a way that entrepreneurs can come in and develop a better process, right? Either to identify with new technology, with AI, where these veins of ores are, or is there a way for the refining process to cut those costs down? Because we know it's going to be fewer and fewer, less dense. Can we somehow drive the costs down? So these are all the things and tons of innovative opportunities for entrepreneurs to come in. And this is what we're going to discuss in this class, or where are the business opportunities?
Even uh, just recently, one coming out of the produced water from oil and gas operations from the Smackover Formation in Arkansas.
Oh yeah, the direct
It's
lithium
a waste.
extraction.
It's a waste product, but
Uh-huh.
all of a sudden they find out it's very lithium rich. So by a different process to take the lithium out of the produced water from the oil and gas operations, and all of a sudden you have a new business model that addresses the need for lithium ion batteries on your storage sort of facility. So, out of a waste comes an idea that could lead it to a business.
Oh, 100%. And that's a day in the syllabus. We're going to talk about direct lithium extraction using the Smackover as an example. And it's interesting that we've been drawing the Smackover essentially is this watershed where it's a brine, so it's salt water, right? But when we say salts, it's not just sodium chloride, it's magnesium chloride, it's lithiums in there. It's also got borate. And it turns out that we've been since the 1960s using the Smackover water with a membrane process to extract and chemical process to extract borate from that same reservoir. Now, it turns out that that same process to extract borate can be transferred to extract the lithium. So, so this is the type of things where these entrepreneurs come out. And you mentioned Fervo, and I want to throw that up as another great example because we do study Fervo. We're going to study them in this class. Um, Fervo is a very interesting company where the founder is a fracker, a hydraulic fracturing engineer. So he came from the oil and gas industry, and he's like, I could probably take this hydraulic fracturing technology and apply it to geothermal and thereby enhance the amount of power we can extract out of the ground. And that's exactly what they're doing.
Mhm. It's
No,
incredible.
there's no question about how some of the things that kind of tie us in knots kind of maybe also untie knots in terms of kind of other opportunities. So good luck with your class. I hope all the entrepreneurs take it because obviously you've got some very important lessons to teach. So
Thank
um,
you.
thank you again. Excellent contributions for us.
It was really great to meet you. Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Hiatt grew up in a farm in Idaho, which led to his interest in agribusiness. And then his research in biofuels sort of led him to agribusiness producing energy as well as food.
The energy transition, as we heard, will be expensive, partly due to having to duplicate an existing energy infrastructure. Now, what we have to really ask is it really worth it?
The UN's policy is to transfer wealth from rich nations to poorer ones. But where are we going to find the money to do this? They want around $300 billion per year, which is just not feasible.
It sure is a lot. And every country are sovereign, so there's no global body to enforce the wealth transfer.
Well, the important economic concept to think of here is the economies of scale. The more that you make something, the cheaper it costs to produce it. So an example of this is Chinese solar panels, EVs, and batteries.
The Business of Energy Transition Initiative from Marshall School of Business at USC, the Energy Speaker Series, is the new course in the business of energy in the 21st century, the annual Energy Summit, and that is what makes this center different. Others focus on the policy that this center focuses, and this center focuses on business.
Energy systems are incredibly complex. This course gives students an insight to how things really work. It's not a plug and play um, sort of thing. The solar does not replace coal. EVs replace IC vehicles. It's not really just moving around like that.
And also, it follows the writings of Vackel Smil, Four Pillars of Industry Society. There's steel, cement, petrochemicals, and fertilizer. And as we heard, they're all dependent on fossil fuels.
Well, there's this really important concept of levelized cost of energy that we talk
Yeah,
about in this podcast.
absolutely. Once electrical grids reach about 20 to 25% of alternate energy, the cost of electricity rises steeply, which impacts our curtailment and storage. So to have the balance of the five factors, affordability, reliability, cleanliness or the environment, security and availability. Those are all important when it comes to, the electrical grids or alternative energy.
Gigascale data centers for GPUs and AI for AI learning use up to 10 times more CPU computing by Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Alphabet. There's an impact on utility in Virginia turning to the geothermal and nuclear because of this. They're insensitive because they're so huge, and they can kickstart new development.
And small modular nuclear reactors are very similar to like Navy submarines. The challenge is that the Navy doesn't follow the regulations of nuclear regulatory commissions, but using this technology for the public could be very expensive due to expensive regulations.
We can't build anything in California due to SEPA, SEPA, which is on average, it takes around 13 years to complete a project due to regulatory costs. NEPA is the federal equivalent of this.
And current European environmental policy is leading to deindustrialization and energy poverty of the economy due to affordability. So, what is the future of Europe?
Well, oil and gas is the most future-looking industry. An example of this is ExxonMobil planning out 50 years ahead.
One of the big questions ahead is where are we going to get the critical minerals needed for electrification and renewables?
I sometimes get confused reading about energy transition progresses. I know a lot about money being spent more in China than in the West, but not so much in developing countries, and that the growth of renewable power capacity, it's increased quickly over the last 2 decades. But despite all the meetings organized by the UN and by the US EPA and DOE and the European Union, emissions are still rising along with the global temperatures. Now, what I have to ask is, are we all on the same page?
That's a great question. Policymakers make it sound like we're moving towards a decarbonized net zero world, but the data doesn't really show it. I know an energy transition will take time given the scale and complexity of our energy ecosystem today, but it's hard to know if we're actually making any real progress. In this episode, we have a special guest, Dr. Gena Al-Hanai, who's a recent graduate from USC. Her research work was to design a risk framework to prevent and prepare the Persian Gulf region, including her native UAE, United Arab Emirates, in the work in the event of a disaster. We learned earlier how difficult it was to form a consensus with the UNFCCC process, but with global competitors like America and China, as long as major players such as the European Union and India, the largest countries by population all compete for the same resources. So you'd expect that there's some differences in policy and priorities. Let's dive in and see if we're all rowing in the same direction with regard to the energy transition.
Around this time in my education was when UAE announced that they were going to embark upon a nuclear power program. And this would be the first of its kind there in the region. And so construction started, I think the same year that I was starting my master's, construction was starting. And so I was really curious, keeping up with the news, what's going on, what's happening, the whole process and everything. And then towards the end of my master's degree, I was looking into PhD programs. And I got accepted in the Civil and Environmental Engineering department at USC. And what drew me specifically to that department was the wide scope of research that was taking place in the department and the interdisciplinary aspect that the department had. And I then took a class with Dr. Mishkati, whom you know. And as part of that class project, he allowed us to basically choose any topic that we were interested in and apply the principles that we learned in that class on that topic of our choice. And so, because I had this interest as what was going on in my home country, the nuclear program, I decided to focus my research paper and final project on that. And Dr. Mishkati, as you know, he is very supportive of his students. And when he read my paper, he was really interested in working further on the topic and told me we should publish a paper together and work more on this topic. So I was excited. Okay, I can take this a little bit further. I was really interested in it. So I was working on that alongside my research that I was already working on for my PhD. It was still first year, so very, very early stages. It wasn't like I was deep into anything. And my current advisor at the time, my current PhD advisor at that time, saw how interested I was in the topic I was working on with Dr. Mishkati. And so one day he calls me in for a meeting, and I was a little bit worried. What did I do? What are you meeting about? So he called me into his office, and I'll always remember this meeting. There were key people throughout my journey that really supported me in helping me, I would say, as they say, spread my wings and fly during the PhD program. Firstly, my family, my parents, they always encouraged me, and then several people along the way. And one of these people was this advisor who I really remember this meeting. And so he sat me down in this meeting, and he told me basically, I noticed how excited you are to work on this topic that you're working on the side with Dr. Mishkati. And I want you to know that if you prefer to work on that project and make that your PhD project and switch advisors and go work with Dr. Mishkati, 100% I will support you. And he told me, this at the end of the day is your PhD. It's not mine. So it's not about what I want you to do. You have to decide what you want to do. And that was such a key moment of support for me. And I sat with that after that meeting, thought about it, and I realized he's right. I was really interested in working on this project. And he recognized that potential in me before I recognized it in myself. And that gave me the courage, I would say, to make that step. And I ended up switching advisors, and my former advisor became one of my committee members for my PhD. And it was, I mean, it was a great support network that I ended up having in the department that I'm super, super grateful to have.
Thank you so much for joining us for the future of energy. Special thanks to each of our guests today and to our technical wizard, Abi, for his important contributions to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you can automatically get access to all our new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.